and welcome back to All Church Sunday School. It is so great to be with you here again, whether you're watching on Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon or Monday, Tuesday, sometime in the middle of the week. Renee and I are both thankful that you are with us. I hope you have your Bibles out. We're continuing our series on the Gospel of Mark, exploring chapter 8 today, and I think we've got a pretty fun conversation ahead of us
I'm
today.
looking forward to it.
So, at this point in the Gospel of Mark, we've encountered quite a few different things. We're going to see a couple of familiar themes, I think, in this chapter today, Renee. But let's start. There's this really interesting quote from Bruce Rigdon. He's at the Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Chicago. This is from the Feasting on the Gospels text, and it's on how the Gospel of Mark invites us in. Bruce writes, Mark is a remarkable storyteller. He addresses his gospel to readers who already know about the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. The stories that Mark tells are therefore directed over the heads of the participants to those who hear or read them in another time and place, including believers today. The narratives invite us in, and the text is therefore interactive. We are expected to react, respond, and participate.
Don't you like that description?
I really do. And I think that's indicative of like what we've been doing here, right? You know, I mean, the emails that we've gotten every single week and the interactiveness of this conversation with the people watching at home has just been kind of a real reflection of this quote from Bruce Rigdon. I
know one of the things that we've learned about telescoping, Mark, kind of tightening the focus, making the action really move, you know, there's energy in the storytelling. It does make it compelling.
Yes.
It does mean that, and, you know, the disciples are regularly jumping in the boat and they're going someplace else. And I mean, it's a good action story that Mark tells. And it's condensed. And so I think it keeps our attention. Yeah. It does invite us in. Maybe we can talk today about how we feel invited into whatever it is we're just about to read.
I would love to do that. I also think the more that I kind of think about the Gospel of Mark in relation to the other three gospel stories, I think Mark is the one that's most well written to be a TV show. You know, just like each chapter could be its own TV show episode, and you get through this season of TV shows.
I could see it.
Gospel of Mark.
And we would binge watch it.
Absolutely.
From beginning to end.
There is no reason in this day and age to wait a week to watch an episode unless you're forced to with WandaVision or something else.
That's true.
You know.
I like this. All right.
So binge watch. That's the next project for Renee and I after All Church Sunday School is creating the TV series Gospel of Mark. Okay. But as we go into chapter 8 today, if you've got your Bibles open in front of you, which I hope you do, you'll notice that we encounter a similar story to something that we've already encountered, the feeding of the 4,000. We're not going to read the feeding of the 4,000, but there are two pretty important differences, I think, between this one and the feeding of the 5,000 story that we've already read. The first one is the location of the event. So with the first feeding of the 5,000, the story takes place kind of by the Sea of Galilee. It's in a Jewish area. The people that Jesus is communing with are people of the Jewish tradition. In this encounter, the feeding of the 4,000, Jesus is in a region outside of the Decapolis. We've encountered the Decapolis a couple of times. It is Gentile territory. And so this feeding happens to a different group of people, and it is indicative of. I said that's twice already now. It indicates, though, that Jesus's intent is to serve different communities. Right. There's a theme in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is for all people. And so this is representative of that. Jesus was feeding a group of members of the Jewish community, and now Jesus is working
about
with
all hungry people.
All hungry people. Doesn't matter where you come from. If you're hungry, Jesus has bread for you.
Now, one thing about the detail also is that these people have been listening to Jesus for 3 days with no food. 3 days. That just proves what a great teacher Jesus was. Can you imagine listening? Even if Jesus came here for a lecture series, Could you last for 3 days without any food?
I can't last 3 hours without food, Renee. You know me.
So this is 3 days without food.
I can tell you what, if there was an instance where I was being lectured at for 3 days, I would have Uber Eats something. Like I would have ordered on the Chipotle app. We're not sponsored by Chipotle. I should say that. Yet, maybe.
We're not sponsored by anyone.
Not yet. But I would have ordered some food on my phone and had it delivered to me wherever I was sitting in the crowd, because 3 whole days. That's too much time.
3 days. And this time Jesus looks out and says, these people are hungry,
yes.
Which may be because some of them were fainting.
Probably.
Some of them had passed out there in the grass because they'd gone 3 days without food. I found the Jesus Maffa illustration of feeding the 4,000, and it looks like a lovely time that they're having. I like the energy of it. Just a reminder that this is an art series created by artists in Cameroon from the Maffa tribe, and they're creating all of the Jesus stories and indigenous Jesus. You see him there in the center. You see orderly passing out of baskets.
Yes.
As we continue to look at it, women and children, and I guess the white robes would identify the disciples, don't you think? Well, there's more than 12. 1, 2, maybe more than 12. I was thinking there's some up on the hillside. There.
Well,
think how happy these people were after 3 days.
Bread would have tasted so good after 3 days. But I do love the Jesus Maffa group kind of relates to the conversation. I believe it was last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, that we were having about representation in imagery around Jesus and the disciples and these stories that we encounter in the Gospels, and just how important it is to reminding everyone that you are included in this story. We're seeing in this feeding of the 4,000 that Jesus is expanding who is included in God's love. And so then we have some really incredible representative art to go with it to just kind of bring home that message, which
Jesus
I think
belongs to everybody.
Is really great. And then the second point that I just wanted to make about the feeding of the 4,000 is, if we remember from the 5,000 story, there were 5 loaves and 2 fishes. 2 fishes. 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's just fish. Then in the feeding of the 4,000, there are 7 loaves of bread. And 7 is an important number in Scripture. For those of you who might know, 7 equals complete or completion. It's an indicator that something has kind of come full term. And so the 7 loaves is often representative of Jesus's mission to include all people in this ministry, now that he is fully engaged in teaching and feeding and healing of people outside of the Jewish tradition. That work is starting to come to kind of its full completion.
So I guess there were quite a few reasons for a second telling of that story.
On the surface, it seems redundant, but I think those 2 details, especially the location detail, is really, really important to know.
Yes, broadening his ministry for
Absolutely. But as we kind of move on now, we've got Jesus moves pretty quickly, as we see throughout the Gospel of Mark. And so starting in verse 11 of chapter 8, we encounter a familiar kind of opposition group to Jesus. Renee, would you like to read for us?
I would be honored. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." The disciples discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? And then he might have said, knuckleheads. Do you think he did?
I think Jesus is upset because we only have 1 loaf of bread. How could 1 loaf feed all 13 of us?
I'm sort of imagining they're in a boat. They probably stepped on it getting into the boat. It's like sunbeam bread, real squishy, where you can just sort of, so this flat loaf of bread, and they're like, oh no. They have just seen so many miraculous things.
Yes.
Why are they? Well, it's because Jesus brought up yeast. That threw them off.
It's true. Jesus does that, and it just reminds me of the phrase, Russ says it quite often, Lord help me, we always say, Lord help me be like the people in the Bible, when in reality it's, Lord help me, I'm just like the people in the Bible. And after 3 days of teaching, and then having had a little bit of bread and only 1 loaf of bread in the boat,
maybe they just weren't
maybe they weren't fully fed. Yeah, but that is an interesting phrase that Jesus introduces here. The yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod.
We wouldn't know automatically what he's talking about. So we would need an explanation too. The description we had at the beginning of our conversation today is how Mark is really telling his story over the heads of the participants to us, but readers today would go, the yeast of the Pharisees. We don't understand
That's
what
not
that
a
means.
phrase
Is that
that
some
is in our
health
vocabulary.
problem that they have, or what? So are you going to help us understand that?
Let's try to figure this out. So we're gonna dip back into Feasting on the Gospels, which is an incredible series. Thank you.
Gathering in theologians and scholars from all around.
Yeah, you'll see Renee and I reference that pretty frequently here, that series. It has a companion series called Feasting on the Word, which is a wonderful kind of just resource of brilliant people coming together to provide some insight.
And if you like these resources, Feasting on the Word is really following the lectionary through the year. But the Feasting on the Gospels, you buy the volume from Mark, and it just goes straight through Mark.
Through the whole thing.
Through all of Mark. So that's been satisfying for us.
It's a fun companion tool for these conversations. But when Jesus says, beware the yeast of the Pharisees, some of the things that he's talking about are, if we understand who this group of people are, they are religious leaders who are in power. They kind of assist their religious group, which in this case are the Jewish folks, in understanding how the laws translate to their daily lives and how they're supposed to live by these laws and following all of these laws. This group of people, the Pharisees, are really kind of the ones who are helping everyone else adhere to all of these laws. They have an incredible amount of influence and power, and they, as represented in the gospel stories, have really kind of become accustomed to being the ones that everyone else kind of checks with and bounces things off of. And so now that there is this character in Jesus who has come along and has really kind of taken away some of that influence and power, is another source of wisdom from on a religious front. They're kind of naturally competing for that same power and influence. And as we see so often in current times, people who are competing for power and influence often do things to maintain that power and influence that sometimes they wouldn't otherwise do. In
a sort of addictive way, you have to keep. Yeah. You have to keep your PR moving forward.
Yeah, there's a PR aspect to this. There's kind of an entrenchment aspect to this as well. If a person's natural instinct when they are challenged is not to change their position, but to dig in. Right. And so I think in the Gospels, we see this kind of traditional group of religious leaders digging in to what they know. And that's a natural instinct.
Sure it is.
And so Jesus is warning against these ideas of protecting your influence and doing whatever it takes, and this kind of rigidity of being boxed in by what you know.
And because it's yeast, it leavens the whole community. It is spreading that their campaign is actually impacting everybody as they try to keep their grip
Yes.
on that, whatever it is. So how do we compare the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod?
Well, there are, you think about influence and you can also say power. So how are we going to maintain our power? How are we going to gain more power? And how are we going to, make sure that there's no one else who's going to come along and take a cut of that? So whether it's religious influence or political power, these are two forces that once you have a little bit, the instinct is to get more and more and more and more and do what it takes to prevent other people from kind of encroaching on your territory. And so Jesus kind of has this understanding with this little phrase that we're gaining some momentum, and that's going to frustrate some people.
And there's going to be more pushback as a result of that.
We're going to start to see some significant pushback here.
Meanwhile, the disciples are just trying to find some more bread.
I just would love some more bread, please, Jesus. Please, Jesus, give me some more bread. And so this, we've talked a little bit during this series, Renee, about Jesus's celebrity status and the growing momentum. And it seems now, we just last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago, encountered the beheading of John the Baptist. And we've talked about the similar story arcs there, kind of the parallels. It seems that Jesus is starting to recognize in chapter 8 the significance of what lies ahead.
Chapter 8 is definitely a turning point chapter for this gospel.
It really is. And so you start to see the tone shift just a little bit now that he has fully kind of reached all of the people in all of the different communities that he's trying to reach. We're going to start to see those other powers that be really start to push back on his influence. So you can see on your screen now kind of some of those ideas that Renee and I have been talking about. For the Pharisees, the insatiable need to defend their influence, this desire to make sure that they are not kind of edged out when it comes to voices that are important on matters of faith. This idea that people in control of religious truths will defend their position, this idea of entrenchment, of digging into what you know and believe to be true. It is so often, I think, even in the modern church, to see people who believe two different things about the same person, Jesus, come to totally different conclusions about the same teaching, and then just for almost their entire lives will just butt heads and butt heads and butt heads. And then this third bullet point, that no matter how often Jesus performs miracles, teaching, whatever it is, there will never be enough evidence, enough signs, enough miracles to convince them that he has authority to make the claims that he does. It's this, I'll believe it when I see it, but on steroids almost. I need one more sign. I need one more example. I need to see you do this and this and this, and then I'll believe.
So interesting to ask for signs immediately following a miracle.
Right.
Do you have a sign?
I just fed 4,000 people.
Of course,
with 7
Jesus,
loaves of bread.
And Jesus doesn't rise to the bait. I mean, he's just like, there'll never be enough signs to satisfy you that I am sent by God.
Yeah.
So just never mind. But Herod, why would Jesus bring up Herod?
So this similar situation, this insatiable desire for power, that those who are rich in power will always desire more power. And if you spend your life defending the power you have, or you think you have, you will abdicate real authority to public opinion.
What an interesting final bullet.
That is a very...
For the times in which we live.
Yes.
Across the board.
Do you want to start, though, with that first bullet, the modern counterparts of Herodian dynasty? I passed over it accidentally.
Well, but Herod is a part of the Jesus story from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And the Herodian dynasty represented power in that part of the Middle East, in that area. And so we have Pharisees with their yeast spreading through the religious elite, and we have the occupiers, the Roman government.
Yeah.
Both of them working to grasp more power, and Jesus presenting a concern on both sides. So,
Yes.
So the disciples are getting a warning, and hopefully after he fussed at them, they paid more attention. Maybe they weren't even listening to Jesus because they were just concerned about. They were counting the number of slices of bread in the package to see how many
Cut it
they
a little
had.
thinner. Cut it
They're
a little
not
thinner.
even listening to Jesus.
They really aren't. They really are not. They're doing the best they can, though.
We get those lessons about power and
Yeah.
about holding on to the power that you have as someone new comes in and says, you know what? I think you're focused on the wrong things. What about this? Mm-hmm. They're not open.
But this whole conversation about yeast and the way that this Jesus movement is about to be pushed back against, maybe even a little harder than we've seen in the Gospel of Mark, that doesn't stop Jesus from doing the things that Jesus is here to do. And we see that immediately following this story about the Pharisees asking for a sign and the disciples being worried about one loaf of bread. So do you want to read for us Mark 8:22 through 26?
22 through 26. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus said, "Do you see anything?" The man looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, and then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored. He saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go to the village." Here's Jesus once again. Don't tell anybody. But I found some art for you. Mm-hmm. The first one Orlu found. Tell us a little bit about that first one.
So this is from the National Gallery of London by Duccio. And these are some notes from the National Gallery of London. That these panels come from the altarpiece known as the Maesta, which means majesty. It's made for the Siena Cathedral. It's the only surviving signed work by the city's leading artist, Duccio.
Was that his first name or his last name? Duccio.
Duccio di Buoninsegna.
Oh, that's so good.
I butchered that. I am so sorry, Duccio. These paintings formed part of the predella, which is the lowest part of the altarpiece. So the stuff, I guess, closest to the ground. But when this picture was completed in 1311, it was carried in a festive procession across the streets of Siena to the cathedral, where it was placed above the high altar. Pretty neat.
It's wonderful to have that kind of detail. Imagine everyone seeing that masterpiece for the first time and making a parade. That's wonderful. I
feel like
that.
We should bring that tradition back. Like someone does something really cool and we just kind of march it across town.
That's just a good idea.
My 2 cents.
So I also pulled the Jesus Maffa version of Jesus healing the blind man. And I have it located next to another painting that Orlu Lager found for us, Christ Healing the Blind Man by Mironov, who is a 45-year-old self-taught Russian painter, defines Christianity as the main theme of his work. And one of the things, I don't have any commentary on the Jesus Maffa version of this scene in Mark, but in the Mironov painting, you notice the light comes from Christ onto the man's face.
Yes.
And the man being healed looks puzzled and expectant. How would you describe his expression? Slightly nervous, do you think?
I would, yeah. I think if someone had just spit on my eyes, I would have been a little taken aback.
And this is, I think, the only healing story that I can think of at this moment where Jesus goes back and makes another adjustment.
Mm-hmm. So
sort of like when you go to get
something interesting about
your eyes checked.
It's
number one or number two?
Number one or number two. Can you read the third line for me? It's an interesting little difference to all of the other healing miracles where it happens and Jesus does one thing and then it's
2020
finished.
vision.
And I wonder if, and I have a note in my Bible about this. This is the second time that it feels like the growing lack of faith around Jesus is impacting Jesus's power. So
that's interesting. Just like when he went to his hometown.
When he went to his hometown and there was so much unbelief around him that his power was affected. We've just seen him come from this instance with the Pharisees and their lack of belief in his power. And now he's bumping up against that same
I hadn't even thought
issue.
about that, but that's definitely a possibility. And and then once again, the secrecy part. Don't go into the village. Don't tell anybody. But of course, the fame is spreading faster than Jesus' warning, which nobody pays any attention to anyway.
It's true. And that, we see that same warning happening again here in the next story in chapter 8 as well, which revolves around Jesus and his disciples having a conversation together.
A very pivotal conversation.
Yes.
Do you want me to read?
Go for it.
Beginning with verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, Jesus asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, but Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns."
Yeah. So a couple of things. This is a very important kind of pivotal text in the Gospel of Mark. As we said a couple moments ago, chapter 8 is when things start to shift. And now here in verses 27 through 33, this is the first time that Jesus kind of reveals to his disciples, this is what's going to happen.
This is what's ahead.
This is what's ahead for me. And it's interesting because it comes with Peter getting the question right, who do you think that I am? And then Peter immediately messing up and saying, Jesus.
It was a fast turn, wasn't it?
It's like when... Gosh, I don't even have a good analogy, but it's like you accomplish one thing and you take a breath for a moment and then like your legs get swept out from under you, or like you're playing basketball and you make a basket, but then you don't get back on defense, and so someone else gets in and scores really quickly. That's the best sports metaphor I've got right now.
Well, don't you think also Peter's bold decision to rebuke Jesus, I think getting the answer right went to Peter's head, and he clearly overstepped to chastise Jesus and say, "No, stop saying that." I think Peter immediately felt so good about getting the answer right that he did himself in.
I wonder if Peter stopped listening. You know how sometimes in conversation you hear something and it's jarring to you, and so you don't hear the next things that come after it? I wonder if for Peter, someone who has committed his whole life to this movement, to this person who is doing all of this incredible work.
After he got out of the boat.
And then he got out of the boat. And so he gets like to the point where Jesus is saying, "I'm going to die." And then he doesn't hear anything else. Like his ears are ringing a little bit.
Back. He missed the resurrection.
And so you can't die. You can't. Please stop saying these things.
I can see that. If this was a scene we were acting out with the help of Harry Parker, I can see how that could be played so that Peter, so beside himself, is reacting almost before Jesus can get the words out of his mouth.
I wonder what goes through Peter's mind in those moments. What's going to happen to him? What's going to happen to this movement? What's going to happen to my life afterwards? And you see it in Jesus's rebuke of Peter. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. The what's next is such a big question for people after an event of that magnitude of losing a loved one. And Jesus just has to, in that moment, say,
I think that's a very
not
sympathetic, empathetic understanding of Peter in this scene. Good job.
Thank you.
Good job.
Peter gets it right, and then Peter messes up tremendously in a couple of different places. And I think Peter is just kind of this perfect encapsulation of the human experience, especially when it comes to matters of faith.
Right. And Jesus is turning. He's not looking Peter in the eye when he says, he turns around so that Peter's actually behind him. And he's speaking now to the rest of the disciples, saying, you've got to keep your mind on what God's plan is. Don't get distracted by anything else.
Yeah.
Peter's just given us a wonderful example. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for allowing Satan to speak through you just for a moment.
Yeah.
Poor Peter. This is really, though, this changes the whole energy of their journey with Jesus. Everything changes on this day with this conversation.
And you notice, too, we're about to explore the last part of chapter 8, but this interaction between Peter and Jesus happens, and then Jesus does two things. First, he physically turns from Peter and calls the disciples and says something. Right. And then the next thing that he does, which we're about to read, is he gets an even bigger group of people together and continues to lecture on the interaction that he just had with Peter. Do you want to read those last couple verses for us?
Starting with verse 34. Then Jesus called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. And Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. Very dramatic. And that last verse is actually the first verse of chapter 9.
Yes.
The commentaries suggest it was really the end of the previous chapter. And it's marked a little bit differently. But this idea of taking up our crosses to follow Jesus, very specific understanding. If you choose to continue to follow, to come with me, here's what's ahead for you.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a colloquial phrase. This is the cross that I bear. But for the first readers of this text, and for the people who were hearing Jesus teach that, crucifixion was a common thing during this time period.
That's important for us to remember that.
And it's really important for us to remember that because, as we see when Jesus himself is crucified, he's not the only one on that hill that day. This was a common technique for getting rid of dissenters and criminals. And Jesus is saying, this is what it costs.
It's much more specific than we would. It's not just whatever the hardest thing is in your life.
Yes.
I mean, we're really talking about a Roman practice, and people would have seen regularly someone carrying their cross to participate in their own death.
And when we think about the context of when the Gospel of Mark was written, we've talked about that a little bit, and that comes when the early church is being persecuted, and they are being rounded up and they are being killed. This is a good word to this early community to remind them that you might die by picking up this faith and walking forward with it. Richard Spalding from Williams College has this to say about these verses. He writes, although this is the first reference in the Gospel of Mark to the cross, it was a familiar image among Jesus's audience and Mark's. Josephus reminds us that the crucifixion was a common sight, a highly public Roman technique of intimidation. Mark was writing from the midst of gruesome persecution. having himself perhaps seen scores of condemned prisoners lugging the horizontal bar, as Jesus had, toward their own execution, Mark would have had every reason to hear this hard teaching in a most literal way.
I think that's very helpful for me.
Me too. Just that this was, for us, the loss of life seems almost like I don't get to do the things that I was planning on doing, or maybe I don't have the career path that I was going to have, or my life will look different. But for first readers of this text and for people who were experiencing this text for the first time, it was a literal loss of life that they might encounter by picking up this faith and walking forward with it. And so I think that as dramatic as these verses already feel in context to the first 7 chapters that we've read,
right?
I think it even heightens the drama,
yes,
a little bit more. This is Jesus. I mean, Jesus is being very clear. This is what it takes.
Nobody in Mark's audience would have said, "I wonder what that means, taking up your cross." Mm-hmm. They would have said, "That's execution." Yes, that's not. Yeah, we scratch our heads as we come in contact with this verse, but this is powerful, and this is, you have to be all in. Yeah, you do. And then there's this interesting note that I'm going to ask you to help lead this part of the conversation, Renee, is this idea of shame and the gospel. That last quote from Jesus, "If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, then the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory," which seems really harsh. Yes. It seems Jesus would be ashamed of me. It's not as unusual if you had a more evangelical background as I did, to hear Jesus reproach us. If you can't share your faith with that person on the corner, if you're ashamed to do that, how do you think Jesus is going to feel about you? I mean, it was a pretty direct thing when we were encountering this. And that is because now I know, after reading this, that's about Paul, really. Paul was the one who took the language around ashamed. Is Jesus ashamed of me? Mm-hmm. Are you ashamed of the gospel? And 3 times in Paul's letters, he writes using some of the very same language. In the first chapter of Romans, Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile." Then he writes in 1 Corinthians, "I am writing this not to shame you, but to warn you as my dear children," as he's teaching. And then finally in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, "So even if I boast freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it." So Paul really took the language from Mark's text here with Jesus to talk about, what are we ashamed of? What are we to? Ashamed is just a really strong word. It is. And we see Paul using a version of that word 3 times. But we don't really, it's pretty unique to this particular passage in Mark. It is. And I think it's important, and you kind of hinted at it, to remember that the text that we have from Paul came before the gospel stories were written. Were written down. So Paul's influence is in here, I think, in these verses a little bit. But it is such a powerful, for me, as someone who didn't grow up in an evangelical background, this idea of shame and faith is very different, I think. Well, of course, I'm not ashamed of what I believe. Most of my contradiction and conflict comes with other Christians, not non-Christians, frankly. And so do I have a hard time sharing my faith with people who maybe don't believe in Jesus? Not really. I have a harder time talking about my faith with people who believe different things about Jesus. So if you grew up in the setting that I did, then being timid, being hesitant, not having the right words to share what Jesus means to you, because you're hearing Paul a lot from the pulpit, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel. That you would hear that quote, and then you would think, oh, if I'm not willing to speak up,
then I'm
proclaim,
ashamed.
Jesus Christ, however clumsily I might do that, I must be ashamed. Paul wasn't ashamed of the gospel. I don't want to be ashamed of the gospel.
Be like Paul.
I need to be brave. I need to speak up. It matters. So, see, it doesn't sound, nobody was going, shame on you, but we knew what Paul said, for I am not ashamed of the gospel.
Yeah.
And so any hesitation on our part, that verse would come to mind. Am I explaining it in a way that makes it more understandable?
Yes.
We knew that verse. And then we also knew Jesus' verse, but I bet the one in Romans was the one that got used the most from the pulpit.
Sure. For sure.
As opposed to preaching from the Gospels. And I'm sure, because I've heard from them, my friends who are part of our class.
Yes.
Some of them are going, we need that, ashamed of the gospel. We need that verse too.
As much as
we had very Pauline upbringing in Scripture.
Well, it's just interesting to read that verse from Romans, and then the second one where it's, I am writing this not to shame you, but to warn you. And I wonder how many people use that Romans text as a point of almost shaming.
Could be.
Maybe. I don't know. Again, not my background. I don't know. But I am...
Beware
Yes.
of the yeast of Paul.
Okay. I think everybody's got a little yeast they're trying to sprinkle around. We better just kind of mind our own, I suppose. Just beware of all of it. I just want to say thank you again to everyone who continues to reach out every single week and provide your own insight and wisdom and thoughts on what we're talking about here at All Church Sunday School. Again, if you'd like to talk about anything that we've just encountered in chapter 8, this really pivotal chapter in the Gospel of Mark, you can reach out to Renee and I at acss@uccftw.com. We would love to hear from you. We're hearing from more and more people every week, which is really cool. And again, shout out to Orlu Logger for all of your help pulling some of these images together. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Next week, chapter 9. Get your Bible out, read up on it, and we'll be back. Be prepared.
Don't be ashamed.
Don't be ashamed. Renee, you won't be here.
I'm going to go see my grandchildren in Utah.
Safe travels to you.
I'll be watching, though.
Yes, and we'll have a special guest, surprise guest on next week alongside me for All Church Sunday School, chapter 9. Gospel of Mark. Have a good one.